Ethical and social issues in information systems. So, after this chapter, you're going to have a better idea for what ethical, social, and political issues are raised by information systems. We change things when information systems change things. We're able to communicate at speeds that we haven't been able to do in the past. We're able to share things we haven't been able to do in the past. And so that puts a lot of pressure on us from a social perspective, from a political perspective. So we'll talk about some of that. What specific principles for conduct can be used to guide ethical decisions? We'll talk about some of those, hopefully kind of give you a way to address some of those issues. Why do contemporary information systems technology and the internet pose challenges to protection of individual privacy and intellectual property? That's what that video is really about. We want to be able to use things like that, use technology to help protect us, but at the same time that infringes on some of the rights that we feel that we should have. And then how have information systems affected everyday life? So again, this chapter started off just like all the others. It starts out with a case and talks about the need to efficiently target online ads. And if you look at some of the various websites that you go, some of the real common ones, the popular ones, Facebook, Google, for example, they gather a lot of information about you. They do it in a variety of different ways. But they use it for marketing purposes. They use it to give you certain ads. So when you put in a search term with Google, the reason you're getting back ads, when you get back the results, you get back ads that are associated with your search term. Same thing with your email, with Gmail. When Google first started offering Gmail, that was a big complaint from privacy advocates. They're looking through your emails and looking for the stuff that you're typing up. Now, they're not trying to associate that with you specifically as an individual, but they are trying to, as a person or as an unknown individual, market to you based on what's in the content of your email. So that was a real issue for privacy advocates. The benefit is you get things marketed to you that you're interested in. The downside is you have those privacy issues. Understanding ethical and social issues related to systems. Recent cases of failed ethical judgments in business. It's pretty obvious over the last several years. You look at corporate America, and it's pretty easy to say, you know what, not everybody's holding up their ethical end of the bargain. Things like WorldCom, MCI, Enron, you name it, there's a lot of different examples. Bear Stearns, my sister actually worked for Bear Stearns when they went under. Fortunately, she was in the legal department, so I don't think she had anything to do with the trading issues, but I like to blame her anyway. Ethics, principles of right and wrong, that individuals acting as free moral agents and used to make choices to guide their behaviors. Ethics, depending on who you talk to, means one thing to one person and means something else to another. It gets confused often with morals or morality, and that's something, again, that depending on the definition that you look to, you might get a slightly different definition. Personally, when I look at the two, they're pretty closely related. Morals tend to be more individualistic. You have your own personal belief system, and if you do something that you don't personally believe in, you violated your own moral code. Ethics tend to be associated more with a professional organization, maybe an ethical code within your business, within your church, within your community, your school, your family. So it tends to be tied to a wider organization of some kind. Information systems and ethics. Information systems raise new ethical questions because they create opportunities for intense social change. We interact in ways that we haven't interacted before. We text when we drive. Probably not the best way to interact. Threaten existing distributions of power. What did we talk about earlier about information is power? Information system shifts power because, if you've got access to the internet, you've got access to computers and the internet, you've got access to a lot of power if information is power. And it generates opportunities for new crime. I mean, you can steal movies and songs on a scale that you never could before. So it creates new opportunities for crime. Model for thinking about ethical, social, and political issues. Think about, the book uses the example of a pond. Think about a nice calm pond When everything's smooth, there's no ripples or anything like that. What happens when you throw a pebble into it? You end up with that ripple effect. The ripples go out and they affect everything in the pond. You can kind of think of IT as that pebble. Something gets tossed into that pond and creates those ripples. And so when you think about that, it's creating a ripple effect that cause social and political institutions, to respond in some fashion. But they can't respond fast enough to technology. Technology changes at a pace that's too fast for it to be able to respond quick enough to really be able to address the issue the way you might want it to. So you might look at it something kind of like that. So you end up with these various political, social, and ethical issues caused by information technology. And it's going to have an effect on your quality of life, and we'll talk about each one of these here a little bit later. Quality of life, your system quality, property rights and obligations, information rights and obligations, and accountability and control. All things that have an impact on us as an individual in terms of our privacy and things like that. So five moral dimensions of the information age: information rights and obligations, property rights and obligations, accountability and control, system quality, and quality life. And these are what we'll be talking about a little bit more as we kind of go through here. Key technology trends that raise ethical questions. Some of the key things that are happening with respect to technology that are causing some of these issues are things like computing power. We get computers that are more and more powerful, more and more capable of doing things. That's great, but now everybody can process a video on their home PC. That means, and we've got broadband internet connections. Now you really can download a 2 gig movie in a relatively short period of time. It doesn't take all that long. So you can steal at a faster pace than you ever could before. Rapidly declining data storage costs. There used to be a time when we had the Y2K problem that storage was so valuable that we didn't dare store those extra 2 digits. Now storage is so cheap, we keep everything. If we ever know your name, your social security number, your credit card number, your eye color, your first boyfriend or girlfriend, your grade you made on the 3rd grade project, we keep all that information because storage is cheap. Networking advances in the internet, copying data from one location to another and accessing personal data from remote locations is much easier. You used to have to mail something, or you copied it to a floppy disk and handed it to your friend, and that's how you kind of pass things around. They referred to it as sneakernet. It wasn't easy to do. Could you steal programs and load a program on more than one computer? Yeah, you could, but it wasn't the easiest thing to do. It took a little bit of effort. With the internet and networking, it's very easy to share this stuff. And advances in data analysis techniques. Statistics. If you think about the businesses, all that information they're storing and all that virtually free storage, now we can analyze that data in ways we've never been able to do before. Before you could apply various statistical techniques, but it took you a while to be able to do it. And if you had a large data set, nobody wanted to crunch those numbers. But now we've got the computing power that can allow us to do that. We can look at some of those unique relationships, kind of like what you saw in the video, a statistical a program that's able to look at text and analyze that statistically and give you information about relationships. And actually, we'll talk about it a little bit later. I'll knock this down. It's right here. Non-obvious relationship awareness. It's actually a data modeling technique that allows you to essentially data mine data from different sources or information out of different databases. But what makes it a little bit unique is it allows you to do it in real time. And so it allows you to find not only those really unique relationships, but it allows you to do it in real time, which means it has all kinds of applications. But it also has certain privacy issues, privacy-related issues as well. So you can kind of look at that with that kind of model. You might have different databases where the data might come from that all allow you to make a decision. So think about somebody that's, I think the example in the book that they used was somebody that's at a casino. Somebody comes in, sits down, and starts winning a lot of money. Well, once you identify who that person is, you can use various databases. You might find out that that person shares a phone number with a dealer that works there. now all of a sudden you can start to say, hey, wait a minute, so maybe something's going on. We need to watch this particular client a little bit closer. Basic concepts for ethical analysis. Responsibility, accountability, liability, and due process. Responsibility is accepting the potential costs, duties, and obligations for decisions. So, we need to be responsible. We also need accountability. Other people need to know who it is that's responsible. So mechanisms for identifying those responsible parties. Liability permits individuals and firms to recover damages done to them. So some kind of a process to, if somebody violates an ethical code, that there's some way to punish them or get remuneration. And then due process, to make sure that they're not convicted without the relevant facts and relevant guilt and all that kind of stuff. So the process of actually going through and analyzing ethics, trying to determine whether or not somebody's violating some kind of ethical code, everybody kind of does this on their own, but I think the book does a pretty good job of trying to spell it out, and I think the advantage to doing that is it keeps you from perhaps maybe skipping over steps or not paying enough attention to certain things that you probably should. So identify and clearly describe the facts. That's something that people probably tend to skip over quite a bit. They automatically jump to conclusions without looking at the facts. And actually, I think this process applies to a lot of things. I think if you think about your homework, for example, if you sit down and you write down the questions first thing, you know what the questions are. You start to formulate the questions and the answers in your mind just by writing the question down, because you've got a better idea of what the problem is. Define the conflict or dilemma and identify the higher order of values involved. So now that you've identified what the facts actually are, what is the actual problem? What is it? What ethical issue have they violated? And if there's more than one, what's the order of ranking? What's the worst one? What's the next worst one, etc. Identify the stakeholders. Who are the key people? Who are the people that are involved? Who was hurt? Who was somehow wrong was done to? Identify the options that you can reasonably take. What can you do? If somebody was cheating, can you kill them? Probably not. I think that's probably not in our punishment handbook or whatever book that we have that says what we can and can't do. But you could probably give them a 0 on the assignment. You may be able to kick them out of the class. You may be able to kick them out of the university. There's a variety of different steps that you can take. And then try to identify the potential consequences of your options. Just because you've got all these options available to you doesn't mean that you want to follow each one. You want to pick the one that's going to be the most appropriate given the infraction. So 6 candidate ethical principles. The golden rule. That's pretty much everybody's heard of that one. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Kant's categorical imperative: if an action is not right for everyone to take, it's not right for anyone. So I'm not better than you, you're not better than me. If I can't do it, neither can you. Descartes' rule of change: if an action cannot be taken repeatedly, it's not right to take at all. So if it's not right to do today, then it's not right to do tomorrow, or the next day, or the next day. Utilitarian principle: take the action that achieves the higher or greater value. Risk aversion principle: that's probably what I follow the most, at least is what my wife would say. Take the action that produces the least harm or least potential cost. She'd say it's because I'm lazy, but take the easy way out, but that's just me. And 6, ethical no free lunch rule. Assume that virtually all tangible and intangible objects are owned by someone unless there is a specific declaration otherwise. I would tell you that probably the recording industry, music and movie industry, probably believe in that one considerably. It's their music, it's their movie. You should therefore respect their right, and if it's not yours, then you should feel beholden to them and be willing to pay for it. And this is what I was talking about earlier. My personal view of ethics, I think it should be associated with some kind of professional association, a church or a school or a profession such as the American Bar Association, the American association, things like that. They have codes of conduct or ethical codes that they abide by. Basically, they promise their promises by professions to regulate themselves in the general interest of society. Essentially, it's an effort to self-regulate. What's the advantage to self-regulation?
You know your industry better than anybody else.
Absolutely. You know your industry better than anybody else. Do you really want people in Washington or people in Austin telling you how to run your business? They probably don't know as much as you do, you would hope. What's the downside?
Leaves lots of opportunity for people to stray.
Yeah, lots of opportunity to say, you know what, yeah, that's probably the right thing to do, but that would really eat into the bottom line. Let's not do that. So there, it's not a perfect approach, but it is an approach, and it's one that here in the U.S. we tend to follow, particularly as it relates to privacy laws. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a little bit. Real-world ethical dilemmas: one set of interests pitted against one another. You run into situations where you do have conflicting ethical interests. There's a case right now. Not this related to IT, but there's a case right now in Georgia where a guy's scheduled to be put to death tomorrow night. And so you have this issue of, this ethical issue of, some people think we shouldn't put people to death. Other people think that justice has to be served, that he was tried by a jury of his peers and found guilty. So you have these two, real ethical issues, legitimate ethical issues that are opposed to each other. And, it's hard to say which one should win. The right of the company to maximize, the example they use, the right of the company to maximize productivity of workers versus the right of workers to use internet for short personal tasks. So using email at work, things like that for personal things. Now, privacy is one of the big things that you always hear about when we talk about information technology. As far as one of the moral issues, it's the claim of individuals to basically be able to control information about themselves, to be able to know when it's being collected, what's being collected, what it's going to be used for, all of those types of things. In the U.S., we don't really explicitly protect your right to privacy. We've kind of extended that right through certain statutes based on the First and Fourth Amendment, but the First and Fourth Amendment don't directly address privacy. So it's kind of an extension. It's kind of something that was kind of an afterthought. Fair information practices is something that came out, I believe it said in '78. And this was actually by a group inside of Congress that did a study, I believe it was in Congress, did a study and looked at some of the relevant issues as it related to privacy, and came up with a set of practices, a set of principles governing the collection and use of information. It's really kind of the basis for our modern approach as well as Europe's approach, even though Europe has taken a different tact, but in terms of handling our private information, FIPS is where a lot of that came from. It's based on the mutuality of interest between record holder and individual. What we mean by that is that in a lot of cases where privacy issues become an issue, it's in transactions. We go to a business and we place an order for a good or a service. Well, for them to be able to process that transaction, that business, they need information. They need our name, our address, our credit card information. They need that information to be able to process that transaction. For us to be able to get that good or service, we've got to give it to them. So we both have an interest in that information. Restated and extended by the FTC in 1998 to provide guidelines for protecting online privacy. The FTC has taken that and modified it a little bit to be able to incorporate the issues of online identities. Used to drive changes in privacy legislation for children, Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, and HIPAA.
HIPAA's evil. The way they're like super conservative.
I'm not a big fan of HIPAA. I think the idea behind HIPAA is great. There are so many little loopholes in it that you can pretty much do whatever you want with HIPAA. For example, anybody can get your information as a student in terms of your transcript and how you're doing currently, even though though HIPAA says you're not supposed, that as a university, you're not supposed to give that out, there's no enforcement mechanism such that if the right paperwork is filed by an individual who just claims to be a parental or guardian for you, there's no mechanism for them to verify that they are. They can get your information, which is kind of scary. The FTC's adaptation to FIP principles, notice and awareness, so notifying people that they're gathering data about you. Now, obviously, if you're placing an order for something, they don't have to tell you they're gathering data. You're giving them data. You should know that. Choice and consent. Choice and consent is the idea that occasionally you'll go to a website, you'll sign up for a service, and you should have a choice about what data they're going to store, if they're going to contact you about for marketing activities, things like that. Access and participation. Once you've given them that information, do you have access to it? Can you go back in and modify it? Can you change it? Can you say, I don't want you to share that with other parties, especially as privacy policies and things like that change. Security. Okay, you've got my information. Are you going to protect it, or are you going to pull a TJ Maxx and share it with everybody? So how are you going to secure it? And then enforcement, giving users an opportunity to get some kind of remuneration if you violate your privacy policy. In the U.S., it's a civil issue. The government's left privacy or violations of privacy in the civil arena. So if a company violates their privacy policy, you have to sue them in order to get some kind of remuneration. In Europe, it's a criminal activity, so it's a significantly different approach in Europe versus the United States. The European Directive on Data Protection requires companies to inform people when they collect information about them and disclose how it will be stored and used. So it's similar in the sense that they're going to tell people up front. It requires informed consent of users, so it's a little bit more stringent in terms of they've got to get basically verification from users. Is it okay to get this information from you? EU member nations cannot transfer personal data to countries with no similar privacy policy. For example, the U.S. When they passed this law, I believe it was in around 98, it was a real issue. Because that meant all these corporations that did business between Europe and the United States weren't going to be able to do business anymore. So it was a real problem. They ended up coming up with this workaround, this safe harbor framework, which basically was a self-regulated group that allowed these organizations, if they raised their policies, their privacy policies, up to adhere to European or EU standards, that they would be allowed to participate and still continue to do business with other European companies and individuals. And then the regulation part of it, or the self-regulation part, is handled internally, is not handled by the government. So it was kind of to address that disparity between the EU's approach and the U.S. approach. That's one of the issues when you start talking about operating in a global environment, is we've got these significantly different approaches, and sometimes they don't mesh together all that well. Any questions so far, or comments? Okay, internet challenges to privacy. So how do they gather information? How do people get information off the internet? Well, one of the big ways, something that gets used an awful lot, whether you've probably heard it if you don't know what they are, cookies. Cookies are just little text files, and they have a legitimate use. They allow the web server that you're visiting to place a little text file on your machine such that when you revisit that web server, it can look at that text file and identify who you are. It may store information like your credit card number, your username and password, and the only server that has access to that is that web server. So it's relatively secure, that and the people on the local machine. So keep a password on your local machine. But for the most part, most companies don't put their credit card numbers on it. That is a possibility. But it has that legitimate purpose. When you log back into Amazon, it has your username. You go back and revisit that page, it automatically knows who you are because of the use of cookies. Lots of banks use them. I believe Blackboard uses cookies. So it's something that's really, really common. Web beacons, or web bugs, depending on who you talk to, is something similar. It's basically code that's embedded in a website. And what that allows the website to do is to kind of track your movement around their website. What page did you come from to get to that page? Was it a page external to their website? Was it another page inside of that website? How much time are you spending on their website? What browser and operating system are you using? So it's not identifying you as an individual per se, but it is identifying your user habits. Now, both with cookies and web beacons and web bugs, if you're nice enough to register on a particular site, now they can link your identity to your web surfing habits, the things that you're purchasing and buying and all that type of stuff. And probably the worst out of the group, spyware, because that's stuff that really doesn't matter what website you go to. Doesn't really matter what applications you're loading. Doesn't even necessarily matter if you're online at the time. It can track a lot of things that you can do, potentially logging things like your keystrokes. It doesn't matter if you keep your stuff encrypted on your computer if it's logging your keystrokes, because you're typing in your passwords. You type in your credit card numbers when you make purchases. So things like spyware can really be particularly bad. Google's collection of private data, behavioral targeting, is used for behavioral targeting. Some people think that Google has more information on us as individuals and our habits, our surfing habits, than anybody else in the world. More information than the government keeps on us. They are just a massive information juggernaut. As far as how a cookie actually works, when the client here first visits the website, the first thing that happens is you put in that request for a web page from a web server. You put in that request, your browser sends that information to the server. It says, I'm using this operating system, I'm using this browser, I've got this IP address. It gives that server that information because that server doesn't know how you're accessing the server. It doesn't know if it's a computer or a laptop or a phone. So based on that information, your web server can make decisions about what kind of web page should you get. Should you get a web page from the regular web server? Should you get the web page for mobile devices that has a different resolution? It can make decisions about that. So it's information that's needed by the server. The server can respond by placing a cookie on that particular computer. And again, when that's done, the server is the only server that can access that cookie. So going to other servers, that's not going to be a problem. Now, that is just a text file that's stored here locally. So if somebody sits down and wants to look at your cookies, which there's probably thousands of them on the machine, but depending on the type of information that this server saves in that cookie, you could potentially have some sensitive information that somebody could read here. But usually, like I said, it's usually just login information. It's not usually credit card numbers, but something to be aware of. So the next time you go back to visit this web server, your computer presents this cookie back to the web server, and the web server says, oh, I remember you. And it's a nice little process. It's something that gives you a lot of kind of a nice feature when you go back and revisit sites and they know who you are. They remember things that you've searched for in the past and things like that. The U.S. allows businesses to gather transaction information and use this for other marketing purposes. That's what I was saying earlier. Basically, we allow corporations to establish privacy policies. As long as you don't violate those policies, everything's okay. If you do violate one of those policies, it's not the government's problem. It's your problem. You have to take it up in civil court. Online industry promotes self-regulation over privacy regulation or legislation for the reasons that we just got through talking about, because they've got more control. They're self-policing. They can turn a blind eye when they want to. But at the same time, the restrictions aren't overly restrictive. However, extent of responsibility taken varies. Statement of information use, opt-out selection boxes, online seals, and privacy principles. Those are some of the approaches that some of the self-regulation advocates have taken, of saying we need to promote privacy to our users. So you see some of those privacy seals. You see things like opt-out selection boxes. There's opt-out versus opt-in, and depending on who you talk to as to which one's better. Personally, I prefer opt-in. but people that like to gather data want to opt out. They want the default to be so that they can gather data. Most websites do not have any privacy policies. Of those that do, most people don't review their privacy policies. Who's read a privacy policy? Any privacy policy? 2 people? 3 people? Okay. Not a lot. And people just don't read them. And in some cases, if you've ever looked at one, there's a reason a lot of people don't look at them. Most of the time they're full of legal language and they're difficult to interpret anyway. Not to mention they change regularly. So just because you've read it today doesn't mean it's going to be that tomorrow. And I think what's interesting is a lot of these organizations don't adhere to their own privacy policies. They put them up there for, if you ask me, really to try to convince people that they're being diligent with your data. Something else that's interesting about privacy policies, some studies will talk that have looked into it, would suggest that people talk about privacy all the time. My data is important. I don't want to lose my data. I don't want to share that information. I don't want to get spammed. I don't want to get all this junk mail. Oh, wait a minute. You'll give me $10 off? Take my stuff. Take my information. So they're willing to sell their privacy for nothing. If you're going to give them a discount, you give them a break, you give them a toy, they will give you their information. So I'm not sure how much we really value privacy. We give a lot of lip service to it. Have your credit card information stolen, and maybe you'll take it a little more seriously. Technical solutions, the platform privacy preferences allows websites to communicate privacy policies to visitors' web browsers. What this is like it says, it's a technical solution. It's a way of codifying an organization's security or information and privacy policy. And when I say codify, essentially it's code that's put on their website that the web browser can read, and then based on that policy, determine whether or not to allow the user to access that website or not. Things like, are you going to accept cookies? Are you going to accept third-party cookies? So cookies that are not from that website, but that are from another website that are linked to that primary website. So it's a way of codifying a privacy policy. And the downside to this is there's not a lot of buy-in from industry. A lot of companies they're not doing it. And the argument is that people don't understand privacy policies. They don't understand the privacy settings in their computers, and so they don't. Even though they have the ability to adjust their privacy settings, they don't really understand what they're doing. So there really needs to be kind of more of a user-friendly approach taken to it before they can do something like this. But I do think it's a good starting point, a good direction to be moving in. This P3P standard, basically, you do the same thing. You put in a request for a web page. The server responds with that web page, but it also responds with the codified privacy policy, as well as a link to the overall policy. And that codified P3P policy basically is information for that web browser to interpret. That web browser interprets that policy and says, okay, what are the things that you're willing to accept? What cookies are you willing to accept, for example? Primary cookies, secondary cookies, etc. And then based on that, it makes a determination as to whether or not to go ahead and load that page, or say, no, you shouldn't access this page. Some of the moral dimensions: property rights and intellectual property. Intellectual property are things that you think of, things that you create from your mind, music or songs and written works, books. Some people might argue programs. Well, programs certainly fall under intellectual property, but some of the specific safeguards is kind of where you might argue how you protect them. The three main ways of protecting them: through trade secrets, copyrights, and patents. Anybody come up with an example for a trade secret?
Coca-Cola.
Coca-Cola. You did spend some time in Atlanta. That's where they're headquartered. Coca-Cola is a great example, just because it's a formula and it's not protected legally from anything. So once that secret gets out, everybody knows their secret. So there's not any kind of legal remedy other than if somebody breaks into their office, you could sue that. Well, breaks into the office, breaks into wherever that formula is stored. Um, there's a criminal activity there, but as far as actually releasing that information, it's kind of the cat out of the bag type thing. You can't get it back in. So it's kind of a dangerous approach, but it's worked well for Coca-Cola. Copyright, statutory grant protecting intellectual property rights from being copied for the life of the author for plus 70 years. I think it's 95 years if you're a corporation or business. So things like books, a lot of times you'll see them copyrighted. Patents, grants creator of invention an exclusive monopoly on ideas behind invention for 20 years. The idea is that these are to help protect the inventors of these various works and give them the opportunity to recoup some of their expenses, to garner some of the benefits of creating whatever it is they created. Challenges to intellectual property rights. Digital media differ from physical media. So think about books in the digital form versus the printed form. It's easy to replicate. Think about a song. People used to bootleg songs and sell the bootleg copies. Every time you made a copy of a record or of a tape, the quality goes down a little bit. The more that original tape's been played, the quality goes down a little bit. With a digital copy, that 1,000,000th copy is just like the first copy. There is no difference. It's all digital. So the ease of replication, the ease of transmission, difficulty in classifying software, should it be protected via patent or copyright or trademark? It's not trademark, but it's hard to classify software. Compactness, it's easy to steal. Difficulty in establishing uniqueness. So digital media is harder to protect because it's easy to share it. It's just really easy to do stuff like that. Now the Digital Millennium Copyright Act is an attempt to try to help protect some of that information. And in this country, it's not illegal to make backup copies of things like your music, your movies, all those various things. It's legal to make backup copies. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act, however, does make it illegal to circumvent protections that have been placed on those, so copy guard type information. So if you're using something to defeat that in order to make a backup, you are breaking the law. But that's kind of the idea behind the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, is to make it illegal for people to try to circumvent some of those protective measures to avoid some of these issues. Accountability, liability, control, computer-related liability problems. If software fails, who's responsible? Remember that issue here a few years ago with Toyota? They had the problem with their cars that they kept accelerating, and they couldn't really figure out what it was. Initially, they thought it was just the individual drivers that they were making a mistake. They were flooring it and ended up crashing. But for precautionary reasons, they went ahead and thought it was a flap that might be catching, something like that. So they did a recall, and that's kind of how it started. And then it got to where there were a few high-profile cases, and a lot of people were really looking into it closer, and they started to think, uh-oh, it might be a software issue in the car itself. And they started looking at it closer and closer. Well, I don't know that they ever really came to a real good resolution as to what the issue was, but in that type of scenario, if it was a software issue, who's liable? Is it Toyota? Toyota may not have coded that information, that program. It's their car, but they may not have been the ones that coded it. Normally, we don't hold people that write books liable for inaccurate information, unless there's some kind of fraud or something like that involved. What's occurred in the past when it comes to software, we've kind of done the same thing with software. That if there's a problem in the software, as long as it wasn't malicious, as long as it wasn't fraudulent, we don't hold people accountable for errors in software either.
You say that in the agreement when you buy it.
Yeah, when you say it, well, we will try to make sure that it's error-free, but it can't be. When you start talking about any piece of code over 10 lines long, and I'm being somewhat facetious, but if there's any length to the code, there's going to be errors. There's going to be problems. That's reality, because the code has become so big and so complex. But it's hard to hold people responsible for coding errors. What should the liability be if software is seen as a service? Would this be similar to telephone systems not being liable for transmitted messages? I think there's a good argument there. It's hard to hold people liable for that. System quality, data quality and system errors. What is an acceptable, technologically feasible level of system quality? Flawless systems are not possible. And this is kind of an extension of the previous slide. Three principal sources of poor system performance: software bugs and errors, hardware or facility issue failures, and poor input data quality, the most common source of business system failure. But flawless software is economically not feasible. Companies ship products with flaws every day. They know that those flaws are there. I'll guarantee you that Microsoft did not ship out Microsoft Vista thinking this is the best operating system ever. It just didn't happen. Having said that, what they do is they essentially make a trade-off and say, we've got to get this product to market. We're going to issue various patches and things like that along the way. We've got to make sure we've got the major issues taken care of. And that's what occurs. Quality of life, equity, access, and boundaries. Mon has joined. There we go. So technology has a variety of negative social consequences. Balancing of power. They talk about balancing of power, rapidity of change, maintaining boundaries, independence, and vulnerability. When they talk about balancing power, they kind of talk about the relationship of the way we used to view technology. Back in the 70s and 80s, everybody was talking about George Orwell, 1984, that we were going to have this big brother that was going to be controlling everything from some central location. It's going to be Washington, D.C. It was going to tell everybody what to do. Well, computer systems have really kind of allowed us to decentralize a lot. So in one sense, that hasn't come to be true. It's allowed us to decentralize a lot of those decisions. But if you look at it from a different perspective, a lot of what we've done is eliminate middle management. We've moved some of those decision-making capabilities out into the field, out to the local areas, which is a good thing. But how much of that decision-making power or authority did we really distribute? Because in a lot of cases, those individuals aren't really making decisions. They're going back to their computer screen, and through networks are essentially the decisions that are being made back at headquarters somewhere. So there's that balance of power. Rapidity of change. Businesses may not have enough time to respond to global competition. Again, when you had a competitor that was down the street, if they did something different, you could respond. Even if they did something that it was going to take you a while to respond to. Because everything was local, you could respond. Your business might hurt for a while, but you could respond and presumably recover. When you start talking about a global marketplace, though, and you've got competitors that are constantly hitting you, you never get a chance to really wake up. I mean, if things turn south, it's really difficult for a business to respond. Maintaining boundaries. Computing internet use lengthens the workday, infringes on family and personal time. We're connected 24/7. Remember that video here a few weeks ago? The name slips my mind now. They were at the computer support guy, and one with Jackie Chan, and the beeper goes off, and then they start checking all their beepers and all their cell phones. It's because they're connected. I mean, always connected. I go home on the weekend, I've got my computers. You guys are sending me emails all the time. And with the exception of about midnight to 6 in the morning, I respond to them. Sometimes there's a little bit of a gap if I'm at lunch or something like that. But people are connected all the time. They go on vacation, they're connected. The book uses the example that, in the writing of the book, they were on vacation, they were on train trips, they were on plane trips. They were in all these different places throughout the writing because they're always connected. So there is that issue. We lose this boundary of work space versus our time alone, our time to kind of regenerate. And dependence and vulnerability. Public and private organizations ever more dependent on computer systems. Organizations are you're starting to lose some of the traditional organizational boundaries. You don't have the departments set up quite like what you once did, very rigid structures. Now a lot of those structures are virtual. They're built around the information system. That's fine until there's a problem with the information system. Now you lose whole departments when your network goes down. They can't do anything. You really want to pay a whole department whatever their salary is to sit there while the network comes back up? I mean, if you're a small company, that might hurt. If you're Wall Street, some financial firm, maybe you weather it, but that's a lot of money. And you're paying these brokers who make $1 million a year to sit there and twiddle their thumbs. Yep.
Like I called Sprint the other day, and their whole website was down, and so they couldn't you could call them, but they couldn't access any of your information or anything, couldn't do anything.
And that's Sprint. That's a company that they should do a better job.
You couldn't log in on their website, or you couldn't get anything through them, so basically everything was stopped.
Yep. Let's see. Computer crime and abuse. Computer crime is the commission of illegal acts through use of a computer, typo in the slides, or against a computer system. Computer may be the object or the instrument of the crime. When they talk about that, it may be the target of the crime. Maybe somebody just trying to tear up that computer. It's a web server and somebody wants to smash it or something like that. Or it may be used in the commission of a crime. Somebody uses a computer to research, how to hide financial wrongdoings and things like that. Computer abuse, unethical acts, not necessarily illegal. Things like spam, not really illegal, at least in a lot of cases, in this country anyway. But some people would consider it unethical, using other people's computers to send out that kind of volume of emails. Employment, re-engineering work resulting in lost jobs. It's an ethical issue. We're going to install all these information systems. As an organization, that's great, right? We're going to automate all these processes. That's what we talked about the last few weeks. Let's automate this stuff. We'll be more efficient. We'll save the company money. What about those jobs we're displacing? Do we have an ethical responsibility to those individuals? If so, what is it? Can we retrain them? Can they be retrained? Are they kind of, are they people that can be retrained, or are they just dead set against it? So that's an ethical issue we have to address as well. Equity and access is often referred to as the digital divide. And the book talks about it from the perspective of the U.S. The digital divide exists not only in this country, but from country to country. So it basically says that there's a difference in access to technology within a country. So for example, in this country, you might have the rich who have more access to the internet, to computers, to those types of resources. You might have minorities that don't have that access. You might have older people who have less access and younger people who have more access. Those are some of the common breakdowns that you have. But at the same time, you have it from country to country. Think about the U.S. We tend to consider ourselves pretty much on the forefront of technology. It's not necessarily the case. We're about 89% or so market penetration in internet access. You look at countries like the Netherlands and South Korea are higher. They have higher speed networks. Their networks are capable of handling a lot more data in terms of video, in terms of being able to process payments. At vending machines, you can use your telephone to purchase a Coke. So there's a lot of things that you can do in some of these other countries. At the same time, there's certain African countries where internet access is over $1,000 a month for dial-up.